Hey guys, so I have a lot of hobbies, and I think that just stems from liking to research a lot. So the things that I end up researching a ton just become my hobbies. One of those is bookbinding. So I thought I would just show you my process, which is kind of just a mismatch of different historical techniques. So all of these papers will be taken and sewn into cords on this sewing press, but first these need to be marked for kettle stitches and where the cords will fall. So I mark a centimeter from each end where the kettle stitches will enter, and then I use dividers unnecessarily to mark where the 5 cords will be placed. There's no real reason to be using dividers, and actually I should have just measured it, but it looks cooler this way. It's also important that for this step that you're very accurate. I, however, am not. These should ideally be in a press, and then all the lines should be marked with some kind of right angle, but I instead just decided to freehand this all the way down, only because I wanted the possibility for the chords to be completely uneven at the very end, ruining the entire project. I'm now going to take an awl, which is actually a takoyaki pick, and puncture holes for where we need on the cords and the kettle stitches. I use a piece of cardboard in the back so that the tip isn't too damaged. In the 18th century, this was usually done all in a press and then sawn in with an actual saw. After I've gathered all the stitches, it's time to start sewing onto the frame, so I'm going to need to raise up a bunch of the cords and go ahead and get to sewing. So I've decided to sew on 5 raised cords, which is really traditional, and you see it a lot during the 18th century, especially in trade bindings from France. This is a sewing frame that I actually made myself, but you can use anything that you have around. This was really simple, just some plywood, and actually in the early 1900s you see people even sewing on chairs turned upside down. I'm now positioning the cords, which have been tightened from the frame above, into the places that we marked for all of the holes. So it's important to make sure that all of these are very, very tight, because if they're not, the binding will be too loose and the covers will be very obviously wonky at the very end of it. The procedure for sewing is actually really simple, so you just enter on the left side of the cord and then exit on the right, making sure to keep the tension on the thread very consistent the entire time you're sewing. When you get to the end, you're just going to go ahead and add your next signature, and then enter again through the top, and then this side, reverse the process. After you've gotten all of your signatures sewn, you're just going ahead and start to tie off the ends by just doing the same thing twice. And I know this part is really fast, but going in depth on it would be very, very boring and honestly not worth it. I'm now going to make some marble paper end sheets using wheat paste. It's important to use wheat paste because if you use anything else, the drying time will be very, very fast and the paper will buckle. This is marble paper that I actually made. The history of marble paper is very, very interesting, and it's really cool, and it's filled with murder and alchemy and insanity, and it's probably not something people would like, but I would like to talk about and I'm very excited. So here I'm just determining where the pattern I want for the end papers to lie, and I'm totally ignoring paper grain because I'm very dumb. I'm also wasting a lot of the marble paper I made because it has areas which are filled with air bubbles that I'm trying to avoid, but more than that, there are parts that are more interesting than others. So I'm going to apply wheat paste to one side of the end sheets and go ahead and apply that to the back of the marbled end papers. We're making end papers because the type of paper that we're using is not the same type of paper that the end sheets are made of, and so it would look really weird if it was just white paper and then suddenly ivory paper. Also, the end sheets' backs are usually messed up from the process of creating marble paper, so that's another reason. Marble paper is very interesting, and I want all of you to know that it is something that is very cool and you should be obsessed with. Now I'm going to go ahead and check the water for all of my plants because I think it's important to water your plants. I'll watch Lucas play some video games, and I'll try to read books while Jack is here while the end papers are drying. And now that they are dry, we're going to go ahead and tip them on using some more wheat paste. So I just put a sheet of waste paper and then I apply about a ½ inch to it, tipping it on to the text block. I just recently watched the movie Knives Out, and Fran's stash box above the chimney actually has marble paper as the lining for the drawers, which is something that is not interesting to you, but is very interesting to me. And now I'm going to go ahead and glue the back of the book and let that only partially dry so that we can start rounding and backing it. And the process of rounding and backing it are just slightly moving it and then hitting it with a hammer, making sure to avoid the cords. This gives our book a slight bend and keeps the spine from collapsing inward. If you've ever seen textbooks from your school that have gotten really old, you'll know what I mean. The spines usually have completely caved in and the book starts to fall apart from there. I'm now going to start preparing the backing boards. These will become the covers of the books. So I just go ahead and measure the text block onto them, and to make sure that I don't mix up which board is which, I just go ahead and mark that as well. And then I cut them to a 1/2 centimeter on every single side. It's important to cut the papers to the size of the boards and then let them dry without weight because we actually want them to bend inward. And now we're going to go ahead and start on the inbands, which are just embroidery floss wrapped around the same cord that I used for the spine. And since the book itself is going to be pretty simple, I've decided to just go with one color around a single core. I've decided to tag the book, that is, where the inband will be anchored is only going to occur 3 or 4 times on the back of the book. In some books you see it on every single signature, especially on fine bindings, but for bindings like this, which are closer to 18th century models, they tag it very infrequently. And now, since we don't want to see the cords underneath the leather, we're going to go ahead and take out a piece of the cover board so that they can sit flush with it. This is done by just taking a triangular portion out of the front and back of both of the lacing holes so that when it's put through it can go ahead and lay flat. We're now going to fray the cords and go ahead and tip them all with some wheat paste so that it's easier to lace into the boards. Here you see a 2-hole lacing pattern, which is more common among the British books of this century. If you wanted to be more accurate, you could use a 3-hole lacing pattern, which is more common among the French. So I've just gone ahead and put them into the front holes and then they exit straight out the back. I then back all of this with just a bit of saran wrap so that it doesn't stick to the waste sheet, and then I put this all under weight. So now we're going to go ahead and dye the goat skin, which we have prepared for the cover, with a green aniline dye from J. Hewitt & Sons. It's very important that the goat skin has been vegetable tanned and not chrome tanned, since this dye and the tooling will not work on anything that's been chrome tanned. Vegetable tanning is a process of using naturally derived tannins, usually from bark, to tan the leather. It takes quite a longer time than chrome tanning, which is just chromium salt added to a piece of skin. So I'm fairly sure that the aniline dye I'm using is dermatologically toxic, so I should be using gloves, but instead I'm just using a hemostat, which is holding a towel and using that to dab it on to minimize my contact with it. Ideally, you shouldn't do this. You should try to be even in your application of the dye, but since aniline dye is very forgiving, even if you mess up, you should come out with a consistent color. We're now going to need to start thinning down the edges of the leather so that we can turn them into the cover. I'm using a French paring knife here on a piece of glass, and I'm just going to take off the links from all of the sides and try to get it to half the thickness which it currently is. I'm also going to need to pare it and thin it until it meets that blue line, which is about 1 inch from the cover. This is the most stressful portion, as it's very easy to destroy the leather. As you can see there, I messed up on the corner, but luckily that will be removed when we do the corner turn-ins. We're now going to start putting the cover on. Since the leather is too porous right now, we're actually going to put 2 applications of wheat paste and just let it dry. This is to make sure that it adheres correctly to the book. If you don't do this, as soon as you open the book, it will break off. I use wheat paste here and on any applications that go inside of the book because I find that if it's on the outside of the leather, that wheat paste will gray over time and give it a really gross appearance. And now we're going to go ahead and put the cover onto the book. So we're just going to apply some wheat paste to the inside of the leather and go ahead and stick it on. Wheat paste I like to use not only because it's cheap and historically accurate, but because it's very forgiving in its application. Since it's very slow drying, it allows me to go ahead and take my time with putting on the cover, which is usually a very stressful process if you use any kind of fast drying PVA glue. And since it's reversible, if I don't like the cover, I can always just take it off by wetting it. And now it's a bit out of frame, but I'm just going ahead and making sure that the leather's adhering to the spine's bands by pressing it with the bone folder. Now I'm proceeding to do the cover turn-ins by applying some more wheat paste. I'm going ahead and doing the headband and in-band turn-ins, which just takes a little bit of finesse, and then it needs to be shaped a little bit with the bone folder so that the leather falls into those back corners that we did onto the cover. After this, I just go ahead and take a Japanese paring knife and I cut the corners so that I can miter them. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach the end sheets. This is the only portion I use PVA glue, and it's because that single strip right there needs to be attached very firmly. This is my favorite part because I need to rip out the waste sheets, which I think is really fun. And then I just go ahead and I attach the PVA glue to that portion that needs to be really firmly held. And then for the rest of the paper, I just go ahead and go with wheat paste. And now I'm just going to go ahead and place the end sheets down and flatten them out with a clean sheet of paper on the joint to make sure it's really secure. I'm going to dry it with it open by just using a little support I made out of some cardboard. Now we're going to go ahead and get to blind tooling. It's important that the surface is wet in order to have a good depression. I'm cooling down the tool so it doesn't burn the leather. I just like to do it before it has a little sizzle. And then I go ahead and I indent the bands using a plain palette. And now I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the front cover. So I'm going to make sure it's damp, and then taking a large gouge, I'm going to freehand some kind of floral design. I'm going to start with the stems, moving on to smaller gouges, and eventually adding flowers and leaf tools. So I finished up what I want the front design to be with some leaves and some flowers, and I'm just going to go ahead and fill in some more because I feel like it was a little bit sparse. I'm going to do the blind tooling first before I do the gold because it seems to work out better that way. I'm now going to take a simple dot tool and just get in between every single leaf to give it a kind of interesting look. And now, in order to get the gold thread here properly, we need a poreless surface. So I'm just going in with some wheat starch paste, which I like better than wheat paste for this because it dries clear and doesn't leave any kind of gray residue. And now we're going to go ahead and add egg glare, which is the adhesive that the glue is going to adhere to. It's made from an egg yolk that's been whipped into a stiff meringue and then left overnight. So the gold tooling is done by just taking a hot tool, which is barely above a sizzle, and tapping it onto the pieces of gold that we've affixed to the book. If you've done it right, you should get a really glossy, flat surface on the impression. Working with gold, especially this 24 karat gold, is very difficult as the slightest little breeze can knock pieces of it off. And it's just very finicky. The wrong temperature or the wrong length of dwell usually messes it up. The history of gold tooling is another really interesting and important thing for bookbinding, and I might be the only one who think it's cool, but it's pretty cool. And here we have the final book all cleaned up from the egg glare. A bit of the gold is broken and the boards are a little bit thicker than I'd like them to be, but I think it turned out well overall. The end papers turned out very nicely, the joint is proper, and the headbands honestly look really good. The deckled edges I think add to it only because I don't have a plow to get them straight enough. I'm really satisfied.